Good day, good gentles. This is Hatching in Medieval and Renaissance Manuscripts. We're going to look at the development of the techniques used by artists La Gantiere. I am from the East Kingdom, Barony of Bicale. I have going to do that. I have a actual undergraduate degree in design and illustration and a master's degree in art education, neither of which have I used extensively in mundane life. I've done other things. I was a librarian. But now I'm doing all of it in my scribal life, and so enjoying sharing what I know. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the use of hatching and cross-hatching in late medieval and Renaissance art. We're going to talk about what hatching and cross-hatching are. We're going to talk about the types of hatching or line work there are, some origins, and then we're going to look at it by different media, and we are going to be looking at techniques and practices, and we'll have time for questions. This is not hands-on. My goal for this presentation is to familiarize you with the techniques through the works of artists in period so that you can use that to assist you in your own development of drawing with hatching and cross-hatching in your own work. In pre-modern art, line was basically used two ways. The first and the most prevalent was the use as a contour or a outline that defined internal and external shapes. The second was hatching or cross-hatching used to delineate light, shade, and or texture. Early in the period, you will see it used sometimes for texture, but not for modeling or creating shape in the form. What is hatching? It comes from the French hachur. It is essentially line making used to create shade and to a lesser extent texture. It can also be used decoratively as a fill design. This wonderful piece by Albrecht Dürer is a drawing, and it has just about all the forms of hatching in one image that you could want to look at. He's used it to create textures in the beard and the hair. He's used it for modeling shadow. He's used it for defining line, for defining contour or the shape of a form. So this is an example of some of the things we're going to be looking at. Hatching is a form of line making used to create shading and to the lesser extent texture. It may also be used, I just said that. Cross-hatching, that's what I want. Cross-hatching is a form of hatching where the marks cross each other, often in layers, typically at less than a 90-degree angle. You'll occasionally, if you look at the cuff here, in this darker shadow, you see some lines that kind of almost accidentally cross at 90-degree angles, but that's really rare. And in these cases, these lines that are crossing at 90-degree angles are curving. When lines are following the volume of a shape, it is what we refer to as contour. Contour can also be used on an outline. So when we look at the cuff on the sleeves, either of them, the outer edge outlines are also contour shaped. They're doing a double job of being an outline and defining the volume of the shape, sometimes by being lighter and darker, sometimes by being thicker and thinner. Um, line weight is important. If you look at the upper right hand, the one with the thumb between the fingers, and you look at the cuff where it meets the hand, you can see a change in line weight from further away from you and then wrapping forward underneath the palm of the hand where it would be in shadow, and that line gets thicker and darker. So that is a use of line weight to help define the shape and also to define shadow. In contrast to hatching, shading is blended to remove any evidence of the line. So when we look at this thumb, we're layering the hatching in multiple layers, and we lose a sense of line, and we are clearly seeing just mostly light and shade through the crisscrossing of the lines. Anybody have any questions about that? Do we have, I can't see chat.
Not at this time.
Okay, great, thank you. Types of hatching. Ooh, that's what happens when I lean on my keyboard. There we go. Types of hatching include parallel. This is when lines are used in parallel sets to create either light or shade value or texture. Contour lines, which we just talked about, follow the contours of the subject, affecting the sense of volume and three-dimensionality. And cross-hatching uses multiple sets of those parallel hatching lines that overlap, usually at less than 90 degrees. And then we have something called woven or patch hatching. These are parallel lines done in small groups going at different directions so that they intersect each other in a kind of patchwork. We'll see some of that later on. Origins of hatching. We don't actually have true hatchwork showing up extensively in scribal work until quite late in period, into the late medieval, into the starting in the early Renaissance, when we are starting to want to define form in a more naturalistic or realistic way. However, hatching exists in other art forms, both for texture and shading, going back to almost some of the earliest work we have. And examples are used here in the upper left in pottery to create a sense of netting and texture. We see it in the animal head post from Oseberg, where we've got on that nose is an example of that patchwork hatching, where we've got the parallel lines not crossing each other, but working in small patches to create a patchwork texture effect. And then we've also got a contoured hatching going around the, for want of a better word, side of the lip. And then decoratively and also texturally used on the Sutton Hoo helmet, we've got it appearing on the mustache in a very naturalistic way, on the nose and on the sides of the face in a more decorative fashion. So hatching definitely existed before it was widely used in the scribal arts and painting. The other place that it exists prior to its use in manuscripts, but in use where manuscript artists would have seen it, is in egg tempera. In the nature of egg tempera, the media itself is both translucent or transparent and dries very quickly. Unlike gouache, which we work with in the scribal arts, it does not lift up. And so you tend to paint with it in layers of finely placed lines or hatching. And you can see that a little bit in the face. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a good clear image of the face, but you can also see its use in the drapery. And while we're not seeing this done in manuscripts, we are seeing it done widely in the panel paintings that scribes would have seen, whether they were secular or religious, in their environment, in their religious environment. So they would have seen this, just not in manuscript context. The rise of hatching, it begins to come into prominence in the late medieval period, when we start to see it modeling on mostly on garments. In the first image on the left, you see it used texturally to roughly delineate maybe a tile floor. And we begin to see it used in a more modeling naturalistic tendency in the drapery. If you look at the face and hands, however, we're still working fairly flatly. We're not attempting to model that face with hatching. We use a little bit of color in there, but we're not using hatching widely to create a naturalistic look in other areas. We don't see it in the architecture. We don't see it in the face and hands. We don't see it in the book. We're really mostly seeing it in the garments modeling. As we move into different area in the Bellures, which is this is a more, for want of better art history word, closer to Renaissance transition piece. And in here, particularly in the draperies, but also you begin to see in the faces, more use of hatching in the paintwork, in the modeling of both the drapery and the figures. You also see it beautifully done in some of the feather work. A little bit in the architecture. And if you look at the rays of the Holy Spirit coming down from the ceiling, you can see some gold hatching work done up near the top of that archway. During the Renaissance, into the 14th and 1500, particularly in France, we begin to see it written about as a technique. It is mentioned by Cizzini, it is mentioned by Leonardo da Vinci, and it is mentioned by Vasari. In this quote, this is a quote from Cennini, and he is talking about specifically hatching or sprigging with red lead in order to render, if I recall correctly, silk cloth. And so they're using, they're beginning to actually describe this as a formal technique. Drawing and hatching. One of the earliest artists where we see extensive use of hatching in drawn work is with Leonardo da Vinci. And he was a master both at using it sparingly, but in a very precise way, both in the use of line weight to indicate shadow and form, but also in the placement of the important blocks of shade. Leonardo is a good person to look at if you are new to hatching, especially when you're trying to capture light and shade. If we look at the horse in the upper left, you'll notice that there is not actually a lot of line hatching going on. But where it is placed very precisely and very meaningfully. A lot of the figure is left empty, but where that hatching is placed tells you precise information. On the head of Leda, he's done a combination, actually. This has some charcoal on it as well as hatching. So he's done the hatching drawing work that's informing what he's going to do with paint. He's using hatching decoratively in the hair, creating textures with it. He's using hatching around the head to create background. And then he's using it around the dark side of the face and the nose to create shadow. He's then gone over with black chalk to indicate the darkness of the hair. So he's used multiple techniques on this. But also look at the wonderful contour lines that he uses for the movement of the hair and how he's using heavy and thin weight on the lines to create movement in the strands of the hair. And that is simply by pressing harder or more lightly and laying down more or less ink as he's moving the pen across the page. Questions? Okay. The other place where we see reinforcement of hatching in the development of its use is in printmaking. Both wood engraving and metal engraving. I'm going to do a quick definition for you on printmaking. Etching, which we do see late in the Renaissance, particularly with Rembrandt, is done with acid. Engraving is done with a metal tool that is carving away the lines of the wood. And that is different than wood cut, in that in wood engraving and metal engraving, the ink is rubbed into the carved lines and then with pressure are lifted onto the paper. Wood cut, the dark areas are left raised and the light areas are carved away. So in engraving, it is the dark lines that are cut. And so it gives you this very precise ability to use hatched line to create light and shade. The more deeply and more repeatedly you cut into the surface, the darker the area will be. And the more gently or delicately you engrave the surface, the lighter the surface will be. If you look at the Adam and Eve in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that Durer is both using directional hatching around his shapes. He's using contour around the bark of the tree. And then he's using line weight in areas like the hair in a very controlled way. One of the things to pay attention to both in drawn hatching and in printmaking hatching is the amount of control that is being used in the line making. Hatching is never scribbly. It is never random. In good hatching, it is purposeful. It is, the artist is controlled. Those are controlled placement of line. You can see a line beginning, you can see a line end. You seldom in the drawn work see hooks on the end of the lines. They're not hurried. This is very purposeful work. I want to point out in the Adoration of the Magi, behind the Magi on the right, you see another example of that patchwork hatching. This patchwork, it's again for texture, but it's all going in the same direction, even though it's done in patches. Also look at the figure on horseback, at how they've used hatching in contour to show the movement of the garment, but also to create a pattern, a very specific pattern. Likewise, the stripes on the lower left-hand figure in the Magi, and how those stripes are very carefully drawn and hatched, and some of them have closer, darker hatching for shading. Painting happens, hatching happens in painting as well. The hands on the left is not painting. This is Durer working on toned paper in drawing, although marginally it could be called painting because he's using likely brushwork for the white work that's placed down. It could be pen, but also maybe placement of white with the brush against a probably an ink and or charcoal drawing on a toned surface. This work in two directions begins to happen quite frequently during the Renaissance as they begin to do more and more exploration of how light and shadow plays on a figure and or an element, and how it's used for definition. This goes hog wild when you leave the Renaissance and go into the Baroque. But at this point in the Renaissance, this is when the exploration of the player of light and shadow begins to be explored. We will try to come back to the blue roller when I get out of the presentation, because the beauty of this is watercolor or gouache. This is a rendering of a blue roller's wing, and the beautiful handling of the line in paint on this is just breathtaking. So we will definitely come back and I'll pull it up online and we'll take a look at that. So here's a lovely piece by Cennini. When you have put in a year, more or less, at this exercise, according to what liking and enjoyment you have taken, you may sometimes just draw on paper with pen, have it cut fine, then draw nicely and work up your lights and half lights and darks gradually, going back to them many times with the pen. And if you want your drawing to come out a little more seductive, put some little washes on them, as I have told you before, with a blunt miniver brush. So he's talking about putting in a significant amount of time learning how to do this technique. My middle and high school teachers will inform you that I spent a significant amount of time studying how to do hatching, mostly in my classes where I should have been doing something else. These are sketchbook drawings by Leonardo da Vinci, and I like to come back to these again to look at the control he has. When we are not talking about a finished drawing, these are sketches. These are studies that he was doing of people probably on the streets around him for potential inclusion in other works. And so these are works that were not spent a long time over. These were works that were done rapidly. But when we look at them, I want you to look at how carefully and purposefully he's using his pen here. The background of the upper left figure, those lines are very carefully just touching upon the outline, the contour outline of that figure's face. They're not randomly crossing into it. They are just hitting that line exactly. The small lines used under the brim of the hat that create the shadow, and the use of the dark underneath the lip and underneath the nostril and on the pupil of the eye to center your attention on the face. And a little bit under the chin to go, the face is what you're looking at. Similarly, the brim on the upper right-hand figure, the brim of the hat helps draw attention to that darkness draws attention into the outline of the face. I love the quick gestures of the feather or tassel that's coming off of the back of the face. Also note the gestural lines used for the hat band. Just simple marks, but it tells you what it is. I love the movement in the lower far left figure in the beard and the jutting chin. But also look at how he's used heavier line weights along the bottom of the ear, the bottom of the beard jawline, under the neck, and those few strands under the bottom of the beard to create movement, but also to indicate where those shadows are. Very different is the center bottom figure, very finely, carefully hatched to the point of it looks like almost he might have put a wash in, but he hasn't. This is all hatched, fine hatched work, developing the shadow in the shape of that center figure. And the figure, oops, that's what I get for tapping on the screen. The figure on the far bottom right is just one of my favorites. Who doesn't love a fancy hat? And this one is just fabulous. Great face, great character, great continued use of the shadowing and mark. All of these are in the handout with links so that you can go directly to the site and spend some time up close and personal with these. When we start to move into manuscript in hatching, again, we see it first and foremost happening in drapery. But if you look at the image on the left, you're going to see beautiful hatched texture in the grass. Notice how it follows the shape of the path. Also, while it's more almost dot-like, there are hatched textures that are layered for those bushes. So those are layers of small strokes or hatching that are defining the shrubbery that's happening around the figures. And then you've got this beautiful fine line, color on color hatching happening in the robes. And then in the spores of black hours, one of the things, especially if you're going to work on a dark ground, is learning to do hatching, light colored hatching on a dark ground. And instead of defining your shadows with your hatching, you're defining your lights with your hatching. So we are hatching all the highlight areas and letting the black just remain as it is, as the shadows untouched. So we're reversing our hatching focus when we're working light on dark paper. And this hastens back if we think back to the Hands by Dürer, where he's working both directions on a mid-tone. He's doing dark hatching to create shadow and light hatching to do highlight. There we go. The other thing that we see late in period is hatching with color on color and gold on color. If we look at these robes, we've got the shadows hatched in a darker color of the blue with the mid-tone being seen underneath the gold hatching that is developing the highlights. So this is more like Dürer's hand, where we're working from a mid-tone and we're working our line work or our hatching in two directions, one darker towards the shadow, and in this case with gold lighter towards the highlight. Questions? That is the end of the presentation. So if you want to stop the recording, we'll do questions and we'll do some up close and personal looks at some of these images if you'd like.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.